All right, so now we've got our cluster built up, and now what we need to do is go ahead and install the NGINX Ingress controller onto this cluster. So what we'll do for starters is head over to the documentation for the Ingress controller and figure out what we need to do next. Okay, so we'll go out to our favorite search engine and just search for NGINX Ingress. And that should bring up the Ingress project, which you can see is hosted over at kubernetes.github.io. And this is a pretty popular project. If you take a look at the GitHub project page for the NGINX Ingress controller, you can see it's got about 12,000 stars, which is pretty significant in all things considered in GitHub open source projects. So we need to figure out how to install this, and they don't really have much in the README here except pointing you over to the documentation to get started. So we'll head back there and take a look at what we need to do to get this installed. So let's head over to the deployment documentation here, and you'll notice that there are a few different ways that we can go about installing the Ingress controller for NGINX. First of all, we could use the Helm package manager, and Helm is a nice utility because it actually wraps up the deployment of various utilities that you want to deploy to Kubernetes, and it packages them up into something known as charts. And so Helm is a nice separate binary that you can use to deploy out to your Kubernetes cluster. However, if you don't have Helm installed on your system, which is admittedly pretty easy to do, but just in case you don't have it, you can just use kubectl apply as well. And there are certain distributions of Kubernetes as well, like Minikube or MicroK8s, that have the NGINX Ingress built in as an add-on that you can install as well. But we're going to be going with the kubectl apply approach, and that's just going to download a manifest for Kubernetes and then deploy it out to our cluster. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different supported cloud vendors here, so we'll just jump down to AWS. And let's go ahead and run the kubectl apply command here to apply the latest version of the package. And you can see that the package actually has the version number in the URL here as well. So we're going to be installing NGINX Ingress controller version 1.1.1, but by the time you watch this, there might be a newer version available. So just keep that in mind. So we'll just click on that button to copy it to our clipboard here, and then head back over to our terminal. And we'll get SSH back into our server here because it looks like we lost our connection. And we'll go ahead and run kubectl apply. So now it's created a whole bunch of different resources here. For starters, it created a new namespace on the cluster called ingress-nginx, and then it creates things like service accounts and config maps and role authorizations and role bindings. It also creates a couple of services here as well. So it creates this admission controller as well as the Ingress NGINX controller. And then it deploys the pods for that as a deployment object right here. And then it also creates this thing called the Ingress class here as well, called NGINX. And so now we can actually create an Ingress resource that uses the NGINX resource type in the configuration for it. So what we can do just to verify that everything looks good is we can run kubectl, and then we want to go into the namespace, ingress-nginx, because that's where all those resources got created. So we'll go ahead and check out ingress-nginx. And of course, we want to do a get all just to see what is inside of there. And you can see we've got a few pods running here. So we've got this create, this patch, and then finally we've just got this controller right here that's up and running. And then down here we've got a couple of services as well. And we've got a deployment that's created a replica set here. And that's ultimately what created our pod right up here. All right, so now that we've kind of seen that we've deployed the NGINX controller and we've verified that everything is up and running, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can actually create an NGINX resource and start routing traffic over to our cluster. But for starters, we'll need to create some kind of service. So I'm going to go ahead and spin up a couple of pods. And so what I'm going to do is actually fire up Microsoft Visual Studio Code here. And I'm going to create a couple of pods as part of a manifest file. So let's find our documentation for a Kubernetes pod spec for starters. And we'll just drill into the documentation here. And here's a pretty good example. So we can basically expose a container port. We're going to run NGINX. And we could also add in some labels to it as well. So let's copy this over into our project here. And we'll go ahead and just paste that in. And we'll put in a few dashes up here just as a separator. Let me change the file type to YAML here so we get the proper syntax highlighting and auto-completion. And then down here, we'll go ahead and just leave the container port at port 80. I'll just change the NGINX container here to NGINX latest. And then up here under the metadata, let's go ahead and just give it the labels property. And then we'll call it my app Trevor v1. So that'll be a selector that we can use in order to spin up a service that points to this pod. Also, the pod is going to have a name here called just NGINX. And then I'll go ahead and just duplicate this down. And then we'll create a second one just called NGINX2 with the exact same configuration here. And then we also need to create a service as well, just to expose this. So let's go ahead and create a service object that uses these pods as selectors. So we'll go out to the service documentation here and just grab this right here. And then we'll go ahead and paste that in. And then we'll give the service a name like Trevor NGINX service. And then we'll give the selector the same label that we used for our pods so that the service can find the necessary pods. And then for our target port, we're going to set that to port 80, and we'll leave our source port for our load balancer at port 80 as well. So let's go ahead and just save this. Actually, I'll just copy this and then bring it over into the terminal here. And we'll do vim deployment.yaml, and we'll hit I for insert and just paste that in, and then save our file and quit. So now I'll create a new namespace for our app. So let's do kubectl create namespace Trevor, and then I'll go ahead and deploy to that namespace. So we'll do a kubectl apply -- file name deployment.yaml -- namespace Trevor, and that should spin up our resources. So we've got two pods here, and then we've got our service controller right here as well. So let's just monitor that to make sure it comes up okay. We'll do a kubectl namespace Trevor get all. And you can see we've got two pods in the running state here, and we've also got our service spun up right here as well. Now keep in mind that our service is configured without a load balancer, so at the moment I don't believe that we're going to have any access to it. As you can see, external IP here is empty, but using the Ingress resource we can actually forward traffic to the service that's running on our cluster. So we'll do that in the next video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.